Hi everyone, Dead Battery here, and thank you for joining me on my channel. Today's video is going to be on the Sega Game Gear. It's actually one of my favorite consoles to take apart and fix because I really like doing the capacitor swap on it. So if you don't know a lot about the Sega Game Gear, it was a system that came out in Japan in 1990 and in the United States in 1991. It was Sega's competition to the Nintendo Game Boy as well as the Atari Lynx and the NEC Turbo Express. The system had a full color backlit screen and it was horizontal. And some say that it was slightly superior to the Game Boy because of this. This time I was able to get a hold of two really unique Game Gears. So in Japan there were a lot of gaming systems that were released as limited editions or special editions that were different from the normal ones. The normal Game Gear most of you have probably seen is the dark gray one with the blue start button, but there were a lot of different ones that were released. And the two that I got a hold of are really awesome and sometimes really hard to find. The first one I found is Magic Knight Rayearth. The second one I found is really hard to find. I'm not too sure how many were made, but I found a Coca-Cola one. So Coca-Cola has their own Game Gear if you didn't know. Both the systems had faults with the screens, and because of that, a capacitor swap was most likely needed. So let's have a look at these systems and see if a capacitor swap does get the screens working and if I have two new working Game Gears. So here are both the systems side by side. The Magic Knight one did have some writing on the back and I was able to get it off with some alcohol. They are both really close in color. I do think the Coca-Cola one is slightly darker. When I turn on the Coca-Cola one, you can see those vertical lines, and unfortunately that usually means that the screen is completely bad. I know with Game Boys you can do the little trick where you run your soldering iron across the traces and it will fix it. Unfortunately, from research that I've done with Game Gears, this is not possible. The Rayearth one does not really show up. It's really hard to see. But it doesn't look like there's any lines on the screen, which makes me think this system could just need a capacitor swap and the screen may be fine. Since the Coca-Cola one had obvious lines and I can't really tell on the Magic Knight one, I decided to first focus on the Magic Knight since a lot of screen issues can be fixed with a capacitor swap. Game Gears are really easy to take apart. There is just 6 screws on the back and then one safety at the top. Once you're inside, you just have to take off 3 of the cables. It's the power cable, the sound, and the speaker. And then you take the screws that are holding the motherboard in place and everything should come out really easily. There are a couple ways to get the old capacitors off. You can try to wiggle them off. The problem with that is you could break or pull a trace up. So since these are rarer Game Gears, I'm just going to put some flux down and slightly loosen the capacitor so I can get the soldering iron underneath, and then just go around and remove all of the old capacitors. I did buy ceramic capacitors from Retro 6. I did buy a whole bunch of these when I decided to start working on Game Gears. They are smaller, and if you do this capacitor swap, I put flux down first to hold the capacitor in place. Then I hold it down with a pair of tweezers and then I solder one side at a time. I do own hot tweezers. I know that they can be used for this as well, but for this and for Game Gears, I find doing it this way works really well. There are a lot of schematics online to tell you where each of them goes. If this is something that you want to try and you can't find a schematic, I will leave a link in the description below to show you where each of these go. You do have to put them in the correct places, and there's no marking on the capacitors except for the bags you get with them. So I would highly suggest doing one type at a time so you don't get confused. Be really careful with this top one. It gets awfully close to the plastic that is holding this cable in place. The first time I ever did one of these, I melted the plastic really badly. Luckily the system still worked, but just be really careful when you're in this area and use a smaller tip on your soldering iron. If you do decide to do a capacitor swap on your Game Gear, just make sure you know what version it is. Version 1/2 has the chips like mine, where it's the one large chip and the smaller one below it. Version 0 has 2 chips roughly the same size next to each other, and version 4 has a large chip and a smaller chip next to each other. I'm happy to see that the screen is working really well, since it was really hard to see the first time. So I'm assuming that there definitely was some bad capacitors in there. Since I was able to get the screen to work, I decided to also do the power board capacitor swap. The easiest way I found to get these out, if you do not have a desolder gun, is to clip the ends, get some solder on your iron, put some flux down, and just kind of pull them from the opposite end once you apply heat. All the capacitors are marked, so make sure you put the correct one in the correct spot and that negative goes on the correct side. The board does have a plus and a minus sign. Once these are all in place, I just flip the board over and solder down all the legs and trim the excess. Now I'm going to put the board back into place and then work on the soundboard. Be really careful with surface mount. I do have hot tweezers. I did not decide to take them out for this, but you really need to put flux down and heat each side and kind of loosely wiggle it up. I've unfortunately pulled up many traces trying to remove surface mount capacitors, so be really careful. So now that everything is back together, I can see what the finished product looks like. This is what it looks like. I think the screen looks really good with it. I'm happy that this one is fully functioning now. So in the end, I was able to get the Magic Night one working. I am going to make another video for the Coca-Cola one, but I knew that the Coca-Cola one was going to take a little more effort because the screen did have the lines in it. If you have a Sega Game Gear and its screen is going a little dim, have a look inside and see if any of the capacitors have gone bad. I would suggest doing a capacitor swap so that the board isn't damaged anymore. I think these systems are really great, and there are a lot of games out there for them. I think there's something like 300 games that were released for the Sega Game Gear. If you own one, let me know what your favorite game is. I definitely have to say mine is Sailor Moon, but that's obvious. I'm really happy that the system works now and that I have a limited edition. If you've done the capacitor swap, share in the comments and let me know how it went for you. Hopefully in the next video we can get the Coca-Cola one working, but with the lines on the screen, I'm not too sure if it is going to be fixable, and if not, I need to decide what I want to do with it. As always, if you like this video, please like and subscribe and share with your friends, and I'll see you again in 2 weeks. Bye!